You are a nobody. Don't pretend you matter. My mom said. Honestly, we forget you exist half the time, my brother added. So I clinked my fork against my glass and said, this won't take long. Just 3 sentences. By the second my mom's face had gone pale. They called it brunch, but let's be honest, it was just Sunday lunch with champagne glasses and sharper insults. I was sitting at the long oak table, the sunlight glaring off the polished surface, when my mother, Diane, leaned back with her mimosa and said it words she had probably rehearsed 100 times. You are a nobody, Claire, she said casually, as if commenting on the weather. Across from me my younger brother Kyle smirked and added, honestly we forget you exist half the time. I tapped my fork gently against my glass. The sound was sharp in the thick silence that followed. Everyone looked at me, expecting a meltdown or maybe some desperate plea, but I didn't flinch. I had learned a long time ago that reactions were just weapons in the wrong hands. This won't take long, I said, voice steady. Just 3 sentences. Their faces twitched with curiosity, irritation. I reached into my bag, pulled out a plain black folder, and slid it across the table with 2 fingers. No speeches. No scenes. Just a quiet little offering on the altar of their arrogance. Diane hesitated before opening it. Kyle stopped chewing mid-bite. Mark, my mother's second husband, leaned in like he expected to see concert tickets. By the time Diane reached the 3rd page, her face had gone pale. Mark's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up. Kyle just froze, forks suspended in mid-air. I smiled faintly. It was finally beginning. My name is Claire Morgan, but in my family I was little more than a shadow. If you asked my mother Diane, she would probably describe me as quiet or difficult, labels that made it easier for her to justify the way she treated me. If you asked my brother Kyle, he might not even remember I was there at all. Growing up, our house looked perfect from the outside. A neat lawn, smiling family photos in the foyer, matching sweaters at Christmas. But behind closed doors, it was a different story. It was a world where attention was currency, and I was always broke. Kyle, 2 years younger than me, was the golden boy. He could break a window and be called spirited. I once spilled a glass of juice and was sent to my room for being careless and dramatic. Diane loved telling people Kyle was full of life while I was so serious all the time. There was one day I remember more clearly than the others. I had won a small art contest at school, a certificate and a ribbon. I came home beaming, proud in a way I rarely allowed myself to feel. I showed Diane the certificate. She barely glanced at it before saying, "You really should focus more on science. Art won't get you anywhere." 2 days later, Kyle brought home a participation ribbon for Best Listener in kindergarten. Diane framed it and put it in the hallway. Moments like that seem small on their own, but they pile up quietly, like snowdrifts against a locked door. Year after year the message became clear: you are less, you are secondary, you are invisible unless you are useful. Holidays were the worst. Kyle would open gift after gift: electronics, video games, designer clothes. I would get practical things: socks, notebooks, sometimes items that looked suspiciously re-gifted. Once, I received a coffee mug that said "World's OK's daughter." I was 16. At family gatherings, Diane would boast about Kyle's bright future, about his natural charisma, while I sat at the edge of the room, smiling politely and pretending it didn't sting. If I dared to speak up, I was told I was jealous. If I stayed quiet, I was called ungrateful. Over time, I learned to make myself smaller, to take up less space, to lower my expectations to the bare minimum. Love wasn't unconditional in our house. It was a prize you had to win, and I was never fast enough, loud enough, or shiny enough to claim it. My father, Richard, was the only one who saw me not the perfect version Diane demanded, but the messy, curious, stubborn person I really was. He helped with homework, listened when I rambled about books, and never once made me feel like a burden. But even that small light would be snuffed out. At 12 years old, I learned just how easy it was for the people you trusted to rewrite your entire world and erase the parts that mattered most. It happened on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. I was sitting on the living room floor, eating a bowl of dry popcorn and flipping through channels without really watching anything. Kyle was upstairs playing video games. Diane was scrolling on her phone, her face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. Then without warning she muted the television and turned to me. Her voice was unnervingly calm. "I need to show you something," she said. Even at 12, I knew that tone. It was the same one she used when a neighbor's dog had been hit by a car, or when she talked about layoffs at work. Serious. Final. She held out her phone. On the screen was a single text message. "If you take her, I'll kill you both." The sender's name was listed as my father's. I stared at it, my heart stuttering in my chest. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Diane knelt beside me, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "You need to understand what kind of man he really is," she said, voice low and urgent. "I've protected you for years. I just didn't want you to be afraid." She rubbed my back like a mother comforting a child after a nightmare. Except this time she was the one who had summoned the nightmare into the room. I wanted to scream, but it couldn't be true. That my father, gentle, steady Richard, would never send something so vile. But the message was right there, glaring at me from the screen. I didn't cry. I just sat there stunned as Diane spun the story that Richard had always been unstable, that she had fought for full custody to save me, that he was a threat lurking just beyond the edge of our lives. By Monday, she had already filed the paperwork. Custody revoked. Visitation rights stripped away. My father, who once spent hours building model rockets with me in the garage, was suddenly a ghost. There were no more calls, no visits, no letters, just silence, and I was told, over and over, that I should be grateful. Grateful to be safe, grateful to be free. But deep down, buried under the fear and confusion, a small voice whispered, "Something isn't right." It would take years before I had the courage to listen to it. The older I got, the louder the questions became. At first, I shoved them aside. It was easier to believe Diane's version of the story than to confront the possibility that everything I had been told was a lie. It was easier to tell myself that memories of my father's kindness were just wishful thinking. That maybe I had imagined the way he used to listen, really listen, when I spoke. But doubts have a way of growing, even in the darkest soil. In college, I would hear my friends talk about their dad's small stories, silly memories, and something inside me would ache. A feeling like grief, sharp and raw, for a man who is still alive but might as well have been buried. The message Diane showed me haunted my thoughts. It didn't fit. My father had cried during Pixar movies, for heaven's sake. He wore safety goggles just to hang Christmas lights. How could that man have written something so violent, so cruel? I told myself to let it go, to move on, to be grateful, just like Diane had taught me. But the questions wouldn't die. One night, after a particularly bad day, a promotion at work ignored by my family, another passive-aggressive dinner where I was asked if I was still doing that little office job, I found myself staring at my phone. Without thinking too much before I could talk myself out of it, I typed a message to the only number I still remembered by heart. "Hi, I don't know if this is still your number, but I wanted to say hello, Claire." I hit send, heart pounding. 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed. "Claire, I've been waiting 10 years for this." That was all it took. The walls I had carefully built around the truth began to crack. We agreed to meet 3 days later at a park halfway between our cities. Neutral ground. Public. Safe. I was terrified he would look different. Harsher. That my memories would crumble when faced with the real man. But when I saw him sitting there on the bench, coffee in hand, wearing the same worn leather jacket he used to wear on chilly mornings, I knew. It wasn't my memories that had been wrong. It was everything else. We sat on that park bench for hours, the cool autumn air swirling around us. At first we spoke about nothing. The weather, his job, books, safer ground, but eventually I asked the question that had haunted me for a decade. "Did you send that message?" He didn't flinch. He didn't protest. He simply shook his head and said, "No, Claire, I never would." He didn't cry. He didn't try to beg for my forgiveness. He just looked at me the way he used to steady certain sad. And something inside me settled. Not because he had proof, but because for the first time in years my gut stopped screaming. Still, I knew believing wasn't enough. Not for what had been taken, not for what had been done. I had to know the truth. It started with curiosity, but quickly turned into a mission. I wasn't a hacker. I wasn't some TV detective. I was just a daughter who needed answers. So I did the only thing I could think of. I trained. I took night classes. I studied. I became a licensed private investigator specializing in digital forensics and background tracing. Not the glamorous kind of PI work you see in movies, the real kind. Quiet, careful. And when I was ready, I moved back home. I told Diane I had lost my job, told her I couldn't afford my apartment anymore, that I needed a little time to get back on my feet. She rolled her eyes but agreed, gave me the laundry room, made it clear that I was there on sufferance, that every load of dishes I washed, every carpet I vacuumed was my rent. Perfect. While Diane and Mark went about their lives assuming I was defeated, I worked in secret, nights spent combing through old computers stashed in closets, afternoons slipping into Mark's home office when he was at work. The breakthrough came in the most unexpected place: a battered laptop shoved behind a stack of old sweaters in Diane's closet. It was password protected, but that wasn't a problem. Inside, buried in poorly named folders, I found it. A Word document. The draft of the message Diane had claimed my father sent. "If you take her, I'll kill you both," typed neatly across the top with notes in the margins. Revisions. A comment bubble from Mark saying, "Too dramatic. Make it sound scarier." I sat back staring at the screen, heart pounding. But that wasn't all. There were emails too. Chains between Diane and Mark from the months before the divorce. Conversations about how to frame Richard, how to manipulate custody, how to hide money. They had transferred assets into offshore accounts, shell companies listed under Mark's name, properties shuffled around like pieces on a monopoly board. Everything Diane had ever said about Richard, that he was irresponsible, dangerous, reckless, it was all a lie. A lie carefully constructed to steal everything from him, and from me. I printed everything, made copies, organized it into neat folders. One copy I handed to my father, one I kept for myself, and one, well, that was the one I slid across the table at brunch. As I watched Diane's hands tremble and Mark's face drain of color, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. For the first time, I wasn't the invisible daughter. I wasn't the burden or the afterthought. I was the reckoning they never saw coming. The moment Diane flipped open the folder, I saw it. First confusion. Then a flicker of fear. Finally, the slow creeping realization that the walls she had spent years building were crumbling and she had nowhere left to run. Mark leaned over her shoulder, his smug smile evaporating as he scanned the pages. Kyle just sat there, fork frozen halfway to his mouth, looking from Diane to me like he was trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. It wasn't. Diane's fingers trembled as she turned the pages, each one hitting the tablecloth with a soft accusing thud. By the time she reached the final document, a complete trail of the stolen assets and the fabricated message, her face had gone ghost white. "You little," she whispered under her breath, voice trembling with rage. Mark shoved back his chair, the legs scraping loudly across the tile floor. "You said you deleted that stuff," he hissed to Diane, completely forgetting I was still standing there. I rose slowly from my chair, adjusting my sweater like I had all the time in the world. I slipped my bag over my shoulder and looked each of them in the eye, one by one. "The originals," I said calmly, "are already with people who matter. This was just for your personal enjoyment." Diane opened her mouth like she was about to say something, some excuse, some denial, but no words came out. Only a small, desperate gasp. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of that house without a second glance. No shouting, no tears, just the truth, laid bare, like a wound that had finally been exposed to daylight. I didn't even bother to grab my coat. It wasn't cold enough to stop me, and honestly I needed the symbolism more than I needed the warmth. Behind me, the house was a beehive of panic. I could hear Mark's voice rising, demanding to know what else I had found. Diane's sharp, panicked whispers. Kyle calling after me weakly, as if somehow I was the one who had broken the family apart. But I knew better. They had shattered it themselves long ago. I had only pulled back the curtain. Later that night my phone buzzed with a series of frantic messages. From Kyle, "What the hell did you just do?" Then, "Mom's freaking out. Mark's yelling. They won't tell me anything." From Diane, just one line. "You're not done. Don't think you're done." I smiled at the screen, the kind of smile that comes from a deep, exhausted peace. They thought they could control the story, that they could control me, but the truth was out now, and it was just getting started. The silence after I walked away was almost louder than the shouting I had left behind. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for it. I checked into a small short-term rental on the other side of town under a different last name. Nothing flashy, just enough distance to breathe while the blast radius unfolded. 2 days later my father knocked on the door. He didn't say hello. He just stood there, a thick envelope tucked under one arm, a tired but genuine smile on his face. "I got the call," he said simply. "It's happening." The lawyer had filed everything: a petition to reopen the custody case, charges to pursue financial fraud, a motion to clear his name. It was already moving forward faster than either of us had dared to hope. I let him inside, made 2 mugs of tea, and we sat on the worn couch like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Do you want to know how I found it all?" I asked, after a while. He nodded, his hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only thing anchoring him. So I told him not every detail, not yet, but enough. When I finished he just shook his head slowly and said, "You didn't have to do this." I met his eyes, steady and clear. "I didn't do it for you," I said. "I did it for me." Meanwhile, back at Diane's house, the fallout had begun. The legal notice arrived in a thick formal envelope. Certified mail. Signature required. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard from a neighbor Diane screamed when she read it loud enough for half the block to hear. Mark tried to act unaffected, but his name was all over the documents. Kyle kept texting me, desperate, confused. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can fix this," he begged. But they didn't understand. This wasn't something broken that could be patched over with apologies and fake tears. This was justice finally coming home. And I wasn't going to stop it. I used to think closure would look like a grand confrontation, a courtroom showdown, a public apology, a sweeping moment of redemption. But real closure, it turns out, is quieter. It's choosing yourself over the people who never really chose you. It's waking up in the morning and realizing you don't owe anyone an explanation for existing. In the weeks that followed, Diane's world unraveled exactly the way you'd expect when someone builds their life on lies. So legal summonses, frozen accounts, friends and neighbors quietly pulling away once the truth started to leak out. Mark tried to separate himself from the disaster, but the paper trail was too clear, too damning. Kyle's sweet, clueless Kyle kept sending me messages for a while. Half-hearted apologies mixed with angry accusations. He never quite decided whether I was the villain or the victim. Eventually the messages stopped. The house where I had once slept in a laundry room was put up for sale. Quietly, desperately, like they could erase the history written in every cracked tile and faded photograph, I didn't feel triumph. I felt free. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trapped in someone else's narrative. I wasn't the invisible daughter or the backup plan. I was just me. I rebuilt my life slowly, carefully. I started my own consulting business using the skills I had sharpened in the shadows. I rented a small, sunlit apartment with real wood floors and windows that looked out over a park instead of a driveway. My father and I had coffee every Sunday, no longer strangers tethered by old wounds, but two people building something new, something honest. It wasn't perfect. Healing never is, but it was real. And that was enough. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt invisible, ever been made to believe that your worth depends on someone else's ability to see it, hear me now, you matter. Your voice matters. The truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, matters. You don't have to carry their lies forever. You don't have to keep proving yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't anger, it's peace. It's building a life so full, so genuine, that they can no longer touch it. And if you're ready to start writing your own story, one where you are the main character, I'm right here with you. If this story resonated with you, please like, share and comment below. Your story deserves to be heard too. And remember, sometimes the quietest victories echo the loudest.